I come to the floor today to speak on the bill that recently failed, despite my colleagues' assertion that they support access to in vitro fertilization for all Americans. You know, this morning, I was able to pack my daughter's lunch boxes. It sounds mundane, I know, but when I spend just a second thinking about it, even that kind of everyday moment with my girls isn't mundane at all. It's a miracle. Because after 10 years of struggling with infertility, after being wounded in combat, I was only able to have my two darling girls through the medical marvel that is in vitro fertilization. The only reason there are PB&Js for me to make for their lunch, the only reason there are teeny sneakers for me to Velcro clothes is because after I came home from war, I had the freedom to seek the health care I needed to make my dream of going from Tammy to mommy a reality. I was one of the lucky ones because now that freedom to get reproductive care is at risk for millions of other women whose most desperate hope in the world is to have a little one of their own. Make no mistake, that isn't some future nightmare. This is our present reality. Countless women already had their IVF treatments interrupted this year after an Alabama State Supreme Court ruling painted women seeking fertility treatments as criminals. And in this perilous moment for our country, as we stare down November and all the uncertainties that come with it, there's no telling how many more will follow. Look, I doubt that Donald Trump even knows what the acronym IVF stands for, and half the time I wonder if he can even spell IVF. But despite the incoherent, delusional, and frankly embarrassing ramblings that came out of his mouth last week, the reality is that he is the reason that IVF is at risk in the first place. The Dobbs decision is what led us to today's nightmare, taking the power to decide how and when to start families from us women and handing it to politicians in state houses across the country. Donald Trump is the one who brags about taking down Roe. Donald Trump is the one who acts like that's something to be proud of. He's like a bank robber who steals cash out of the till and flees the scene and then still expects a reward for calling the police to report a crime. So while it may now be convenient for him to claim that his support of IVF is as huge as the made-up crowd sizes at his rallies, we know the truth. He is the reason that IVF is in danger. He is to blame. He and every other Republican who cares more about staying good with Trump than about doing good for the Americans they are supposed to be serving. Many, too many of those Republicans are in this very chamber. I know that because today marked the third time in the past 7 months that I've come to the floor begging my Republican colleagues to help me pass legislation I wrote that would protect every American's right to IVF, regardless of what state they live in. A bill that would ensure no doctor or hopeful mom could be criminalized for trying to start a family. One that would permit all health insurers to cover the treatments, and one that would require the federal health insurance plan to cover reproductive technologies, allowing our troops to preserve their sperm or eggs before deploying to a combat zone. When I tried to pass it in February, it took the junior Republican senator from Mississippi what seemed like not even one full Mississippi second to block its passage. Then, when I tried to pass it again in June, nearly every GOP member voted it down. Today, it was the same old cynical story as Republican after Republican voted no, no, no. And at this point, it's obvious. Despite whatever talking points they force through gritted teeth on cable news, when the rubber hits the road and the vote is called, Republicans will do anything to get out of actually passing legislation that would protect women's right to access reproductive health care. Women in this country have been through enough. What women don't need is a man who is found liable for sexual abuse controlling what we can or cannot do with our bodies. What we don't need are politicians who have sworn fealty to a convicted felon treating us like we're the ones who are criminals. It's tragic. Republicans only seem to care about protecting life when it supposedly consists of some cells in a medical lab freezer. But what about when that life is of fifth graders whose school day gets shattered by a man with an AR-15 who wants to turn their math class into a massacre? What about when that life is their neighbors who is yet one more woman to bleed out on the delivery table as the maternal mortality crisis among women of color rages on? Well, then those same Republicans couldn't seem to care less about defending the sanctity of life. Listen, I'm sure that some of my colleagues will try to slink away from taking any accountability here. Per usual, they'll shout some ridiculous excuse like, this bill would allow for human-animal hybrids, as if anyone would ever believe that. And for the record, it would not. Or to those folks, I say that this afternoon's vote was your chance to put your vote where your mouth is. It was your chance to prove that you believe that every woman in this country deserves the chance to be called mom without also being called a criminal. Instead, your true policy beliefs, your hypocrisy, your misogyny showed through. Look, I went to war to defend this nation's rights and freedoms. I did it because I believe so deeply in the importance of that mission. I wasn't asking my GOP colleagues to head into combat to show that they cared deeply too. I wasn't asking them to do anything hard at all, actually. All I was asking them to do was to simply support a bill that could have represented millions of women's only chance of starting families. All I was asking of them was to vote in a way that reflected the position they claimed to have when they were spouting talking points on Fox News. They couldn't even do that. So on behalf of every woman who has faced a heart-shattering struggle of infertility, all I can say to my Republican colleagues this afternoon is, shame on you. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I first want to thank our colleague, Senator Duckworth from Illinois, for her leadership. Anyone that sees the beautiful pictures of her two girls with their different personalities, both of whom would not be here without these procedures, would understand just once you see those kids, as we all know people in our families, with our friends, our neighbors, who literally their families are there because of this procedure, understand how disappointing this vote was. That's a Minnesota euphemism of what happened in just the last hour, where we only had two of our Republican colleagues, the same two who voted with us last time, who were willing to stand up for IVF. IVF is a miracle medical treatment for families who couldn't otherwise have children. Over the last 4 decades, 8 million babies have been born around the world thanks to IVF. Yet today, we are moving backwards. The right to IVF is under attack because 2 years ago, the Supreme Court decided to shred half a century of legal precedent and strip away women's right to make their own healthcare decisions. Now American women are at the mercy of a patchwork of state laws, as my colleague from Illinois just described, which governs their access to reproductive care, including fertility treatment. What happens in Minnesota now is way different than what happens in our neighboring states of South Dakota and North Dakota, where in fact women have crossed the border to get the kind of health care they need, instead of, as my colleague noted, as has happened in Oklahoma and other states, bleeding out in parking lots because they have no choice. We saw it happen, of course, when it comes to IVF in Alabama. Their February Supreme Court decision brought IVF procedures in the state to a halt, leaving more than 2 million women in that state without access to this treatment. Whatever happens legally, court cases and the like that change things, go back and forth, it really is all the same thing. All of this angst, all of this actual disastrous effect on women's rights could have been prevented. But instead, we have a group of people, which does not reflect where 70 to 80% of the American people are, who've decided that politicians should make these decisions about a women's health, that politicians should be the ones that are going to decide about IVF or are going to decide about whether or not people can get abortions or the kind of birth control that they want, or even have access to mifepristone. I used to think that the people who were opposing us on this wanted to bring us back to the 1950s, but now it looks like it's 1850s. The people of this country deserve better. I'm thinking of Maida, a woman from Minnesota who became a mom thanks to IVF. In her own words, "I am the proud mother of twin girls, but without IVF and my ability to access treatment, they would not be here today. Our twins are almost 8 years old, and I cannot imagine my life without them. They are incredible humans who are already bringing so much love, joy, and hope into this world. Every parent deserves that hope. No court, no politician should interfere with that hope. But right now, that hope is under attack. And today, many of my colleagues chose to deny that hope to women across the country. In doing so, they are working against the will of 86% of Americans who believe IVF should be protected and legal. Attacks on reproductive freedom and freedom in general, that's not what today should be about. I refuse to settle for a reality in which my daughter has fewer rights than I do or her grandmother did. And I will never stop fighting for a future where women, and not politicians, are in charge of their own health care decisions. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.